Millionaire took his dog walker girl to a business dinner, and what she did shocked everyone. Ethan Carter stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse apartment, staring out at the sprawling city below. The view was breathtaking, a glittering expanse of lights stretching into the horizon. Yet to Ethan it felt like nothing more than a painted backdrop. At 34, Ethan was a self-made millionaire, the founder of a groundbreaking tech company. His sharp intellect and relentless drive had propelled him to the top of the business world, earning him respect and envy in equal measure. His name often appeared in magazines, his successes analyzed by the media, and his lifestyle admired from afar. But behind the glossy facade, Ethan felt isolated. In a world where everyone seemed to want something from him, money, connections, power, he struggled to trust. Even his closest relationships felt transactional, built more on mutual benefits than genuine connection. The only creature Ethan truly trusted was Max, his loyal golden retriever. Max had been with him through it all, the late nights, the high-stakes meetings, the crushing disappointments. Max didn't care about stock options or flashy cars. He only cared about Ethan. Ethan's world changed slightly one crisp autumn morning when he took Max for a walk in the park. He usually hired professional dog walkers from an agency, but that day, with a rare gap in his schedule, he decided to handle it himself. As he strolled along the tree-lined path, Max suddenly tugged at the leash, pulling Ethan toward a group of dogs playing near a fountain. Among them was a young woman with a radiant smile, her laughter filling the air as she knelt to pet a rambunctious terrier. "Max, slow down," Ethan called, trying to keep up. The woman looked up as Max bounded over to her. "Well, hello there, handsome," she said, scratching Max behind the ears. Ethan approached, slightly out of breath. "Sorry about that. He gets a little too excited sometimes." "No problem," the woman replied, still smiling. "He's got a great personality, full of life." Ethan glanced at the other dogs gathered around her. "Are all of these yours?" "Oh no," she said, standing up. "I'm Sophie. I'm a dog walker. These are my regulars." Sophie Lane was the kind of person who stood out without trying. Her auburn hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, her cheeks flushed from the cool air. She wore a simple hoodie and jeans, but her presence was warm and magnetic. Sophie had been working as a dog walker for 3 years, a job she had stumbled into out of necessity but grown to love. She had always had a natural affinity for animals, and this work allowed her to connect with them in a meaningful way. Sophie was a pure-blood detective dog. She liked to work with litter of gin, who brought out the best in her. Her life hadn't been easy. After losing her father during her final year of high school, Sophie had taken on multiple jobs to support her family. Her mother's health had declined, and the medical bills piled up, forcing Sophie to abandon her dream of becoming a veterinarian. But despite the challenges, Sophie remained fiercely optimistic. She believed that happiness wasn't about what you had, but how you chose to see the world. She found joy in the little things, a dog's wagging tail, the smell of fresh coffee, the golden light of a sunset. That first meeting with Sophie left an impression on Ethan. There was something refreshing about her unpolished honesty, her lack of pretense. A week later, when his schedule became overwhelming again, Ethan decided to hire Sophie as Max's walker. He could have gone through the agency, but he specifically sought her out. There was something about the way she connected with Max, and the way she had treated Ethan, not as a wealthy client but as a person, that drew him back to her. Sophie was surprised to receive Ethan's call but happily agreed. Over the following weeks, she became a regular presence in Max's life, and by extension, Ethan's. Every afternoon, Sophie would arrive at Ethan's penthouse to pick up Max. The first few times, their exchanges were brief. Ethan would hand over the leash, Sophie would thank him, and they'd go their separate ways. But as time passed, their interactions grew longer. Sophie would linger to tell him about Max's adventures in the park, the new dogs they'd met, or the funny things Max had done. Her stories were animated, full of vivid details, and Ethan found himself looking forward to them. After a half hour, they stopped to eat dinner at a craft-Asian lunch coon in which the two diddled off with different handlebars. After the evening, Latham had called it a night on his own, watching the dogs, and had asked Ethan to come over and meet Max before the family departed. After the evening, Latham had called it up on his way home from work, feeling quite proud of himself. For Sophie, these moments were a welcome break in her day. She was used to clients treating her as invisible or replaceable, but Ethan seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. For Ethan, these conversations became a window into a world he had almost forgotten, a world of simplicity and joy, free from the pressures and facades of his professional life. He began to see Sophie not just as someone who cared for his dog, but as someone who reminded him of what it meant to truly connect. One day, as Sophie handed Max's leash back to Ethan, she said, "You know, Max is one of the happiest dogs I've ever met. He's lucky to have you." Ethan smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "I think I'm the lucky one. He's probably my best friend." "Dogs have a way of bringing out the best in us," Sophie replied. As Ethan watched her walk away that evening, he realized that Sophie had begun to bring out something in him, too. Something he hadn't felt in years. In Sophie, he saw someone who wasn't impressed by his wealth or status, someone who treated him as just another person. And in Ethan, Sophie saw glimpses of a kind and thoughtful man, hidden beneath the layers of success and skepticism. Neither of them knew it yet, but their connection was the beginning of a journey that would challenge their perspectives, transform their lives, and uncover the true meaning of trust, respect, and love. Over the following weeks, Ethan and Sophie's brief exchanges gradually turned into genuine conversations. Each time Sophie came to pick up Max, she brought a burst of warmth and positivity into Ethan's otherwise sterile, business-oriented world. At first, Ethan remained guarded, unsure what to make of Sophie's openness. Her animated stories about Max's antics at the park, how he chased a squirrel halfway up a tree or made a new best friend in a mischievous pug, were refreshingly light-hearted. She talked about life with an honesty that Ethan wasn't used to, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself lingering by the door to listen. Sophie, meanwhile, had been surprised by Ethan's demeanor. She had expected him to be aloof, perhaps even dismissive, like some of her wealthier clients. Instead, she found a man who, though reserved, was attentive and curious. He didn't interrupt her stories or check his phone while she spoke. He listened, really listened. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It was a pale young man, with no mustache or beard. One chilly Friday afternoon, Sophie arrived at the penthouse as usual to pick up Max. She was greeted not just by the golden retriever's enthusiastic tail wagging, but by Ethan, who looked unusually hesitant. "Sophie," he began, handing her the leash, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, curious. "I have this, dinner tomorrow night," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's a business event, kind of formal, and, well, I was wondering if you'd come with me." Sophie blinked, caught completely off guard. "Me? To a business dinner?" Ethan nodded. "I know it sounds strange, but I need someone there who I can trust, someone who won't put on an act or try to impress anyone. You're one of the few people I feel comfortable around." Sophie hesitated, her mind racing. She wasn't sure why Ethan would want her, of all people, to accompany him to such an important event, and yet she couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice. "But I'm not exactly business dinner material," she said, gesturing to her casual outfit. Ethan smiled, his confidence returning. "You'll be fine. Just be yourself. That's all I'm asking." After a moment's thought, Sophie nodded. "All right, if you're sure, I'll go." That evening, as Sophie walked home, she couldn't shake her nervous excitement. She hadn't been to anything remotely close to a formal dinner, let alone one attended by powerful business figures. What would they think of her? Would she embarrass herself? Or worse, Ethan? Determined to make a good impression, Sophie borrowed a simple but elegant dress from her best friend Claire. The next day, she spent hours getting ready, carefully taming her hair and applying makeup. When she finally arrived at Ethan's penthouse, she looked both radiant and apprehensive. Ethan, dressed in a sharp navy suit, was waiting by the door. His breath caught slightly when he saw her. "You look amazing," he said, his tone sincere. "Thanks," Sophie replied, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "I hope I don't embarrass you tonight." "You won't," Ethan said firmly. "I'm the one who should be thanking you for coming." The venue was breathtaking, a grand ballroom with sparkling chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved gracefully between tables, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. As Ethan and Sophie entered, the room seemed to shift. Heads turned, curious whispers followed them. Most attendees were accustomed to seeing Ethan with polished, high-society women, lawyers, executives, heiresses. But tonight, he had arrived with someone entirely different. Like some younger brother who'd walked into the room in a cute cotton summer dress that was a bit too small for his normal style. Sophie felt the weight of their gazes and clung a little tighter to Ethan's arm. "Are you sure this was a good idea?" she whispered. "Trust me," Ethan replied softly. "You'll be fine." They were soon approached by several of Ethan's colleagues, a mix of business partners and potential investors. While Ethan introduced Sophie as a friend, she could sense their polite but skeptical smiles. At the table, the conversation initially revolved around the usual topics: market trends, investment opportunities, and company growth. Sophie stayed quiet, unsure how to contribute. But as the evening went on, she began to notice something. Despite their polished exteriors, many of the attendees seemed oddly detached from reality. Their discussions, though intelligent, lacked the grounded perspective she was so used to in her everyday life. When one guest lamented about the hardships of managing a company, Sophie couldn't help but chuckle softly. "What's so funny?" the man asked, his tone sharp. Sophie hesitated, but then replied honestly, "It's just, my neighbor runs a small diner. She works 12-hour shifts and still finds time to bake cookies for the kids in our building. When she talks about hardships, it's about paying rent or keeping the lights on. Perspective can be funny like that." The table fell silent, and Sophie felt her cheeks flush. Had she said too much? To her surprise, Ethan smiled and chimed in. "She's right. Sometimes we lose sight of what real challenges look like." The tension eased, and the conversation shifted. Sophie, emboldened by Ethan's support, began to share more, little anecdotes about her life, her clients, and of course, Max. Her genuine humor and down-to-earth insights captivated the group. By the end of the meal, even the most skeptical attendees were laughing and nodding along to her stories. As the dinner wound down, Ethan led Sophie out onto the terrace, where the cool night air provided a welcome reprieve. "You were incredible tonight," he said, leaning against the railing. Sophie laughed, still a little surprised by how well things had gone. "I don't know about that. I just tried to be honest." "That's exactly why it worked," Ethan said, turning to face her. "You weren't trying to impress anyone, and yet you did. You reminded me, and everyone else, what really matters." Sophie met his gaze, her smile softening. "You know, you're not what I expected, Ethan. When I first met you, I thought you'd be like, well, a typical millionaire. But you're different. And you," Ethan said, his voice low, "are more than I ever could have imagined." The moment lingered, charged with unspoken emotions. For the first time, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. And for Sophie, standing there with him under the city lights, she began to wonder if this unexpected connection could lead to something far greater than she'd ever dared to dream. The grand hall was alive with opulence. Glittering chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, illuminating the marble floors and the elegantly dressed guests, mingling with champagne flutes in hand. Ethan had chosen one of the city's most exclusive venues for this business dinner, a place designed to impress even the most discerning attendees. As he entered with Sophie by his side, the room seemed to shift. Sophie wore a simple, floor-length black dress that Claire had lent her. It wasn't designer, but it fit her perfectly, accentuating her natural beauty. Her auburn hair was loosely styled, and the only jewelry she wore was a delicate silver bracelet her mother had given her years ago. The grand curtains had been taken down from the picture windows, and she was propped comfortably on a dark blue sofa at the front of the crowd. She looked stunning, but Sophie couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She felt like an outsider stepping into a world she didn't belong to, and the whispers and glances from the other guests weren't helping. Ethan led Sophie through the room, greeting colleagues and business partners along the way. Sophie noticed how their eyes flickered to her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and condescension. "Who's that with Ethan?" she overheard one woman whisper to another. "Neither's usual type, that's for sure," the other replied, her tone dripping with judgment. "She's a dog walker," another voice chimed in, followed by a soft laugh. The words stung, but Sophie kept her head high. She wasn't going to let their shallow assumptions ruin the evening, or her growing connection with Ethan. Ethan, meanwhile, noticed the whispers but chose to ignore them. He was focused on Sophie, making sure she felt comfortable in the unfamiliar environment. "You're doing great," he said quietly, as they approached their table. Sophie forced a smile. "Let's just say it's interesting experience so far." The table was a mix of Ethan's closest business allies and a few influential investors he hoped to win over. Sophie found herself seated between Ethan and a middle-aged man named Gregory, a senior partner at a prestigious venture capital firm. The conversation started predictably, with discussions about market trends, quarterly reports, and the latest mergers making headlines. Sophie listened intently, though much of the jargon went over her head. Gregory turned to her at one point, his smile polite but clearly forced. "So, Sophie, what line of work are you in?" "I'm a dog walker," she replied honestly, meeting his gaze. Gregory raised an eyebrow. "A dog walker? That's unusual company for a dinner like this." Sophie felt a blush creeping up her neck, but refused to let it show. It might seem unusual, but it's surprisingly rewarding. Dogs are great judges of character. They keep you humble and honest. Gregory chuckled, though the amusement didn't quite reach his eyes. "I see. Well, it's always good to have variety in life, I suppose." Ethan, sensing Sophie's discomfort, interjected smoothly. "Sophie's one of the most hard-working and insightful people I've met. She has a way of seeing things from a perspective most of us overlook." The comment silenced Gregory, though Sophie noticed the faint smirk on his lips. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to a new project Ethan's company was developing, an app aimed at streamlining urban logistics for small businesses. The group debated potential features, target demographics, and the challenges of breaking into an already saturated market. Sophie sat quietly, unsure whether she should contribute, but as the discussion grew more animated, she noticed a pattern. The group seemed fixated on high-level concepts, without considering the practical, day-to-day realities faced by small businesses. Finally, unable to hold back, Sophie spoke up. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but have you considered how this app would work for someone who isn't tech-savvy?" All eyes turned to her, the room suddenly quiet. "What do you mean?" one of the investors asked, his tone curious but skeptical. "Well," Sophie began, choosing her words carefully, "I work with a lot of small business owners, dog groomers, pet shop owners, even some independent trainers. Many of them struggle with overly complicated software or apps that require too much time to learn. If your app isn't user-friendly and accessible, you might lose a significant portion of your target audience." The group exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her input. "And another thing," she continued, gaining confidence, "you should think about adding a feature that connects businesses with local freelancers. A lot of people I know would love an app that helps them find short-term gigs or part-time help. It could create a whole ecosystem within your platform." For a moment, no one spoke. Sophie's heart raced as she wondered if she'd overstepped. Then, to her astonishment, one of the investors nodded. "That's actually a great point. Ethan, have you considered something like that?" Ethan, who had been silent, watching Sophie with a mix of pride and amazement, finally spoke. "We hadn't, but it's a brilliant idea. Sophie's absolutely right. We need to think beyond just the core features and focus on what people actually need." The mood at the table shifted. The condescension Sophie had felt earlier began to fade as the group engaged her in more questions. They were curious about her experiences, her observations, and her unique perspective as someone outside their corporate bubble. Sophie answered honestly, drawing from her daily interactions with small business owners and freelancers. Her insights were practical, relatable, and refreshingly grounded. By the end of the meal, even Gregory, who had initially dismissed her, seemed impressed. "You've given us a lot to think about," he admitted with a nod. As the guests began to disperse, Ethan guided Sophie toward the exit. The whispers from earlier had been replaced by murmurs of admiration and curiosity. "You were incredible tonight," Ethan said once they were outside. Sophie laughed, still a bit dazed by everything. "I think I might have said too much." "Need it all," Ethan replied, his expression serious. "You reminded me, and everyone else, what this is all about. Real people, real solutions. That's something we often lose sight of." Sophie smiled, her earlier nervousness replaced by a quiet sense of pride. For the first time that evening, she felt like she belonged. Not because of what she wore or who she was with, but because of what she had contributed. And for Ethan, watching Sophie stand her ground and command respect had only deepened his admiration for her. She wasn't just someone who walked his dog. She was someone who had the power to change the way he saw the world, and the way the world saw him. As the evening progressed, Sophie felt herself easing into the flow of the conversations. Though she'd started the night feeling like an outsider, the respect she'd earned from sharing her practical insights had bolstered her confidence. Ethan stayed by her side, quietly marveling at her ability to hold her own among some of the sharpest minds in the room. Then, the unexpected happened. A man in his late 40s approached their table. His sharp suit and confident demeanor marked him as someone accustomed to this elite crowd. But as his gaze landed on Sophie, his expression shifted from curiosity to recognition. "Sophie Lane?" he said, tilting his head. Sophie froze, the familiar voice catching her off guard. "Professor Dalton?" she replied, her tone tinged with surprise. Ethan looked between them, his curiosity piqued. "You two know each other?" Dalton smiled warmly. "I used to teach Sophie at university. She was one of the brightest students I ever had." The room seemed to quiet slightly, ears perking up at the exchange. Sophie's cheeks flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably under the growing attention. "I had to leave," she said softly, avoiding Ethan's gaze. "Unfortunately, yes," Dalton added, his tone regretful. Sophie was on track to graduate with honors in business and economics, but she had to drop out due to family circumstances. A real loss for the academic world. The revelation hit Ethan like a wave. He'd known Sophie was intelligent and resourceful, but he hadn't realized the depth of her abilities or the sacrifices she'd made. He couldn't stop himself from asking, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Sophie looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not something I like to talk about. My mom got sick, and I had to choose between staying in school or taking care of her. It wasn't a hard decision." Her voice was steady, but there was a faint edge of vulnerability that Ethan hadn't heard before. The room, however, was less kind. A few skeptical murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Well," one woman said, her tone sharp, "it's admirable, but doesn't it seem convenient to end up here at a business dinner with someone like Ethan?" A man beside her chuckled. "Indeed, one might say she landed on her feet rather well." The insinuations hung in the air, unspoken but clear. They were accusing Sophie of using her circumstances, and Ethan, for personal gain. Sophie's back straightened, her hands clenching slightly at her sides. "You're right," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I did land on my feet. Not because of convenience or luck, but because I worked for it." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. "I didn't have the luxury of finishing my education, but I've spent every day since then building a life I can be proud of," she continued, her voice unwavering. "I walk dogs, I take odd jobs, and I face challenges most of you wouldn't understand. But none of that makes me less worthy of being here." Her gaze swept across the room, landing on the woman who had spoken. "You don't have to accept me, and I don't need your approval, but I won't let anyone reduce me to a stereotype or a convenient narrative. I am who I am, and I'm proud of that." The air in the room shifted. Even those who had silently judged her couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for her courage. Ethan watched Sophie with a mix of awe and admiration. He had always known she was special, but in that moment, he realized just how much she'd impacted his life. She wasn't just the cheerful dog walker who had brought light into his days. She was strong, principled, and unapologetically herself. She had faced hardships he could barely imagine and had emerged with her integrity intact. For years, Ethan had been surrounded by people who played roles, who wore masks to gain his favor. But Sophie was different. She had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and that made her the most extraordinary person he'd ever met. When Sophie returned to her seat, Ethan turned to her, his voice quiet, but filled with conviction. "You're incredible, you know that?" She smiled faintly, her earlier confidence giving way to a touch of vulnerability. "I'm just me, Ethan. And that," he said, reaching for her hand, "is more than enough." As the evening drew to a close, the room was abuzz with murmurs, not of gossip, but of genuine admiration. Sophie had not only defended herself, but had also left an impression on people who rarely gave second chances. Professor Dalton approached her again as she prepared to leave. "I always knew you had something special," he said warmly. "You proved it tonight." "Thank you," Sophie replied, her voice soft but steady. Ethan and Sophie walked out of the grand hall together, Max waiting in the car to greet them. As they stepped into the cool night air, Ethan looked at her and said, "I don't think I've ever been prouder to know someone." Sophie glanced at him, her eyes searching his. "Even if I don't fit into your world?" Ethan shook his head. "Sophie, you don't just fit, you elevate it." In that moment, Ethan knew he didn't just admire Sophie. He needed her. And Sophie, for the first time, felt truly seen, not for what she lacked, but for everything she was. That evening marked a turning point in both their lives, one where respect, trust, and love began to intertwine, setting the stage for a future neither of them could have anticipated. The air in the room was heavy with silence. Sophie's powerful defense of her life and choices had left the guests stunned. their judgmental whispers replaced with a mix of admiration and discomfort. Ethan could feel the tension radiating from Sophie as she returned to her seat beside him. Her shoulders were straight, her chin high, but he knew how much it had cost her to stand up to the scrutiny of the room. He couldn't let her face it alone. Ethan stood, his commanding presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Clearing his throat, he began to speak, his voice steady and deliberate. "I'd like to say something," he announced, glancing around the table before fixing his gaze on Sophie. "Sophie Lane is one of the most remarkable people I've ever met." A ripple of surprise ran through the crowd. "When I first met Sophie," Ethan continued, "I was struck by her kindness and the way she connects with others, especially Max, my dog. But as I got to know her, I realized there was so much more to her than meets the eye." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This is a woman who works harder in a single day than most of us probably do in a week. She's faced challenges that would break many of us, yet she carries herself with grace and humility. And tonight, she's shown a level of courage and authenticity that's rare in any room, let alone one like this." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared interrupt. "Some of you may see her as just a dog walker," Ethan said, his tone sharp. "But to me, she's so much more. She's a reminder of what really matters: integrity, resilience, and a willingness to see the good in people, even when it's hard." Crim jean sweat dripped off his face in big trickling streams. His eyes softened as he looked directly at Sophie. "Sophie has changed the way I see the world. She's reminded me that it's not about the titles we hold or the wealth we accumulate. It's about the impact we have on others, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Sophie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Ethan's words had pierced through her defenses, leaving her both touched and overwhelmed. As Ethan returned to his seat, the room erupted into a mix of polite applause and murmurs. Some guests seemed genuinely moved, while others struggled to mask their discomfort. But Ethan no longer cared what they thought. He leaned toward Sophie, his voice low. "You okay?" She nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you, Ethan. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied firmly, "and I'm not done yet." Sophie blinked, confused, as Ethan stood again and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time tonight, but I think I'll be leaving early," he said. The murmur of surprise rippled through the room. "I've realized there's something far more important waiting for me outside," Ethan added, his eyes twinkling as he glanced at Sophie. "Max probably needs a walk." Laughter broke the tension, and Ethan extended his hand to Sophie. "Shall we?" Sophie hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. Together they left the table, the whispers of the guests fading into the background as they stepped out into the cool night air. Max greeted them enthusiastically as they approached Ethan's car, his tail wagging furiously. Sophie crouched to pet him, her earlier tension melting away under the warmth of his affection. Ethan retrieved Max's leash and handed it to Sophie. "Shall we take him for a walk?" Sophie looked at him, her smile growing. "You're really leaving your own dinner for this?" Ethan shrugged. "What's the point of staying? The best part of the evening is right here." They began walking down a quiet path, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Max trotted happily between them, occasionally stopping to sniff at bushes or wag his tail at passers-by. For the first time that evening, Sophie felt at ease. "You didn't have to stand up for me like that," she said after a while. "I can handle people like them." "I know you can," Ethan replied, "but I wanted to. You deserve to be seen for who you really are, not judged by people who don't even know you." Sophie glanced at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You're not what I expected, Ethan Carter." "Neither are you," he said with a chuckle, "and I'm really glad about that." As they walked, Ethan realized just how much Sophie had come to mean to him. She wasn't just someone who had brought light into his life, she was someone who had reminded him of what it meant to truly live. He stopped suddenly, causing Sophie to turn back. "What is it?" she asked, concerned. Ethan smiled, his expression soft. Nothing. I just wanted to thank you for being you." Sophie laughed, shaking her head. "You're a strange man, Ethan." "Maybe," he said, grinning, "but at least I'm learning from the best." As they continued their walk, Sophie felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. Ethan's actions had spoken louder than any words ever could, showing her that he truly valued her for who she was. And for Ethan, the decision to leave the dinner and prioritize Sophie over the opinions of others marked a turning point. He realized that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or status, but in the connections we make and the moments we share. That night, under the city lights, with Max happily trotting beside them, Ethan and Sophie took the first steps toward a future filled with trust, respect, and something neither of them had expected to find: love. The air outside the venue was crisp and refreshing, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension Sophie had felt during the dinner. The echo of Ethan's words, his public declaration of admiration and respect, still lingered in her mind. She walked alongside Ethan, Max happily leading the way, and felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and something warmer. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. "Thank you, Ethan," Sophie said softly, breaking the silence. "For what?" Ethan asked, his tone light. "For standing up for me in there," she replied. "You didn't have to do that. You could have just let them talk." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. "I couldn't let them do that to you, Sophie. You've done nothing but be yourself, and that's more than enough. If they can't see your worth, that's their problem, not yours." His words, spoken with such conviction, brought tears to Sophie's eyes. She quickly looked away, embarrassed. As they continued walking, Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You know, when I first hired you to walk Max, I didn't think much of it. I thought you'd just be another person coming and going in my life." He paused, then chuckled softly. "But then I started looking forward to seeing you, hearing your stories, watching how you connected with Max. It reminded me of something I hadn't felt in years." Sophie glanced at him, surprised. "What's that?" "Joy," Ethan admitted, his eyes meeting hers. "Real, unfiltered joy. You brought that into my life without even trying. And tonight, when I saw how strong you were in that room, I realized just how much you've changed me." Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. She wasn't used to being spoken to like this, as if she were someone important, someone who mattered deeply. They reached a park bench and sat down. Max settled at their feet, chewing contentedly on a stick he'd found. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie stared at the ground, her mind racing. Her whole life, she'd been underestimated. She was the girl who hadn't finished college, who walked dogs for a living, who wore second-hand clothes and dreamed small dreams. But Ethan saw something in her that no one else had. He saw her resilience, her kindness, her ability to find joy in the simplest things. And for the first time, Sophie allowed herself to believe that maybe she was more than she'd given herself credit for. "You've given me a lot to think about," Sophie said finally, her voice steady but soft. Ethan turned to her, his gaze filled with curiosity and hope. "Good things, I hope?" She smiled faintly. "Good, but scary. I've spent so much time being independent, keeping my guard up. It's hard to let someone in, especially someone like you." "What do you mean, someone like me?" Ethan asked, tilting his head. You're, you're, Sophie said with a small laugh. Successful, wealthy, polished. And I'm just me. We're from completely different worlds, Ethan. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding. None of that matters to me, Sophie. What matters is how you make me feel. You make me want to be better, to see the world the way you do. And that's not something I've found in anyone else. Sophie looked down at their joined hands, her heart pounding. She thought of the many walls she'd built around herself, the fear of being hurt or judged that had kept her from trusting others. But Ethan was different. He hadn't just told her she was valuable, he'd shown it, standing by her side when it mattered most. Okay, Sophie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay, Ethan echoed, his brow furrowing in confusion. Sophie met his gaze, her smile growing. Okay, let's see where this goes. But you have to promise me one thing. Anything, Ethan said, his expression earnest. Be honest with me, she said firmly. No games, no pretense, just you. Ethan nodded. You have my word. And you dealt her a lithe-looking nod and smiled. As they sat there, a sense of calm settled over them. It wasn't the dramatic, sweeping moment of a fairy tale. It was quieter, more real. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt truly seen, and Ethan felt truly understood. You know, Sophie said, breaking the silence, I'm not sure how Max feels about sharing his favorite human with me. Ethan laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. I think he approves. He's been rooting for us from the start. Max wagged his tail as if on cue, making them both laugh. As they stood to leave, walking together under the soft glow of the streetlights, Sophie felt lighter than she had in years. Ethan's words and actions had shown her that she was more than just a dog walker, more than someone trying to get by. And for Ethan, being with Sophie felt like a second chance, not just at love but at life itself. She had reminded him of the beauty and simplicity, the power of kindness, and the importance of authenticity. Together, they began a new chapter, one built on trust, respect, and the quiet understanding that true connection has nothing to do with wealth or status. It's about seeing each other for who they truly are. As they walked into the night, with Max happily trotting between them, it was clear that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. The months following that pivotal evening at the business dinner marked the start of a beautiful transformation in both Ethan and Sophie's lives. Their connection, forged through trust and mutual respect, blossomed into a partnership that neither of them had expected, but both of them cherished. Sophie, with Ethan's encouragement and support, decided to pursue a dream she had long buried, a center for dog care and training. With her deep love for animals and innate ability to connect with them, she envisioned a place where dogs could be nurtured and trained in a loving environment, while also helping owners better understand their pets. Ethan helped her secure the funding and find the perfect location, a charming brick building with an outdoor space big enough for dogs to run and play. But he made it clear that this was her project, her vision. I'm just here to cheer you on, he told her with a smile as they stood in front of the building on opening day. The center, aptly named Paws and Hearts, became an instant success. Clients raved about Sophie's personalized care and her uncanny ability to bring out the best in their pets. For Sophie, it wasn't just a business, it was a way to give back and build a life filled with purpose and joy. For Ethan, being with Sophie brought a sense of balance that had been missing from his life for years. He began to reevaluate his priorities, realizing that the endless chase for success and recognition had left him empty. He started delegating more responsibilities at work, trusting his team to manage the day-to-day operations of his company. This gave him time to explore new interests and, more importantly, to spend time with Sophie and Max. Ethan also became more involved in Sophie's world. He volunteered at her center, helping with events, and even learning a few tricks about dog training. For the first time in his life, he felt a part of something not driven by profit, but by love and connection. One sunny afternoon, Sophie and Ethan walked through the park, Max happily trotting ahead of them. The three of them had fallen into an easy rhythm, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. "You know," Sophie said, glancing at Ethan, "I never thought my life would turn out like this." "Good or bad?" Ethan teased, a playful grin on his face. She laughed. "Wow, good, better than I ever imagined." And Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. "You've made my life better too, Sophie. You've shown me that happiness doesn't come from success or wealth. It comes from being with the right people and doing what truly matters." Her eyes softened and she reached out to squeeze his hand. "You've changed my life too, Ethan, not because of your money, but because you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Max barked, breaking the moment, and they both laughed as he ran circles around them, his tail wagging furiously. Their story wasn't a fairy tale with grand castles or dramatic rescues. It was real, grounded in the challenges and triumphs of everyday life. Together, they proved that love and respect could bridge even the widest gaps in background and circumstance. Ethan learned that value wasn't tied to status or power, but to the ability to connect with others on a genuine level. Sophie, in turn, discovered that she was capable of far more than she'd ever given herself credit for, and that vulnerability didn't make her weak, it made her human. Their journey was a reminder that true worth comes from who you are, not what you have. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Ethan and Sophie reached a quiet clearing in the park. Max flopped onto the grass, content from his day of adventures. Sophie sat beside him, her hand resting on his golden fur. Ethan joined her, his arm gently wrapping around her shoulders. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the world go by, knowing that they had found something rare and beautiful in each other, a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and a shared appreciation for life's simple joys. As the camera pans out, capturing the trio silhouetted against the vibrant sky, it leaves the audience with an image of unity, love, and the enduring strength of authenticity. This is how their story ended, not with grandiose declarations or material triumphs, but with a quiet moment of connection that spoke volumes about the lives they had chosen to build together. A life not defined by wealth or titles, but by the love they shared and the lives they touched along the way. Thank you for joining us on this heartwarming journey of love, trust, and transformation. Ethan and Sophie's story reminds us that true worth isn't measured by wealth or status, but by the connections we build and the kindness we show. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that touch the soul. Until next time, remember, the simplest joys often create the most profound impact.